Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I do hope that you will find this webinar to be of value and hopefully be able to get some information out of it. Now, a lot of people often ask me, when living abroad, where do I set up my investments or my savings? Do I send something back home, do it at home? Or do I keep my money abroad and do something, somewhere else? Are there other options or better options available to me living outside of South Africa? And then the big question, which I get asked on a very regular basis, well, what about buying a house back home or a flat and renting it out? What about property? Do I send my money back and buy a flat or a house? Property is, after all, it's a great investment. And that is what led us to this webinar today. Now, first, a bit about me, Matthew Taron. I'm a senior associate with Holborn, and I'll get into more details in a moment who Holborn is. I'm quite familiar with living and working abroad and earning income. My background is in tax and accounting. I am a member of the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investments, and I passed both my level 3 and 4 chartered exams in the UK. So let's dig in then and get to why we're all here. Now, a bit of information first about Holborn, the company, who we are and how we've come about. So essentially, Holborn found its ways just over a quarter century ago in the late 90s. We're the second largest independently owned financial advisory globally, and we have assets under administration of just under $3 billion with licenses and offices in, well, now just over 14 different jurisdictions around the globe. A bit of a background of what makes Holborn different from everyone else out there. Well, our company's success is founded on our 5 pillars, and we'll find often that those are also the same reasons why people choose to do business with Holborn. Our size, firstly, the fact that we are the second largest independent wealth advisory globally, with licenses and offices in over 14 different jurisdictions spanning the globe, all the way in the Far East, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Vietnam, in Australia, coming through Thailand, Saudi Arabia, Dubai, Mauritius, in Europe, Cyprus, Portugal, Spain, the UK, South Africa, Namibia, and in the US, managing just shy of $3 billion. And because of that size, we're offered preferential rates, and we have access to solutions and products which your average retail or even your large institutional company back home in South Africa doesn't have access to, which obviously greatly benefits our clients. The second pillar of our success is the fact that we are truly independent. So we are not owned, nor are we incentivized by any one fund or product provider. We are paid homogeneously across the board, meaning that we're able to choose who we work with based purely on merit to our clients with great impartiality. And as I like to tell many people, yeah, let's be honest, if this was 4 years ago, 5 years ago, and I was working for Sanlam, I mean, you and I both know it doesn't matter what conversation we have, I'm going to give you a Sanlam product. Likewise, if I was sitting here with an Allan Gray or Investec badge on, what are the chances I'm going to offer you an Allan Gray or Investec solution? Another reason why people do business with us and why we've grown successfully is our service. The fact that we pride ourselves in being in front of our clients at least once a quarter, making sure that every 3 months they're being kept up to date on market conditions, changes in legislation, any new funds or products out there. So we take that client service very seriously. And as you can see from above, we're constantly award winners when it comes to that client service. Another reason is our education, the fact that when you're speaking to a Holborn wealth manager or an advisor, you're speaking to one of the best qualified advisors out there globally. All our wealth managers and advisors are required to be internationally qualified. I myself, as mentioned earlier, through the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investments in the UK, which is the industry leader when it comes to financial education globally, as well as obviously doing the regulators' exams wherever we're located. Safety, another reason why clients do business with us is because we take that safety of our clients' assets and wealth very seriously. We will often look at jurisdictions where we know the governments can often back the investments, and we don't trust just any one asset manager as the custodians of our clients' wealth. So that then a bit of a brief background about Holborn, now to get into the actual nitty gritty. So what is the background with me wanting to do this webinar on property? First of all, one of the things that often very regularly comes up when I'm speaking to clients or from people from different parts of the world, they keep telling me, I wish I'd met you 3 or 4 years ago. I wish I'd met you last year or 2 years ago. Why? Well, let me give you a real world, an actual example. And this is from, I updated this because this is a person I spoke to last week, a South African living in Beijing. She bought a home in 2016, so around 8 years ago, for 537,000. And in our conversations with her, she was telling me how she was paying 4,000 on her bond back then, and now she's paying close to 6,000, 8,000 with her levies and insurance included. The house now is worth 700,000, so it has grown somewhat. But in her own words, I'll definitely make a loss if I sell it now. And this is 8 years later. Why? And this is not the first time. I get this on a very regular basis. Why? Well, it's the expectation versus reality. The expectation is you go based on what every single person out there has told you, your mom, your dad, your friends at school, your brother or sister even. It's the best investment you could ever make. 10% growth. You put up your rent by 10%, the property grows by 10%. Things are great. Whereas if we look at this example of this client, well, her property only grew by 3.8% each year from 2016 to now, 8 years later. And in her own words, yes, her bond was 4,000 then, and well, I can get 5,000 to 6,000 rent. In reality, at the moment, she's getting actually less than 6,000 rent. And like as mentioned earlier, her bond with her levies and her insurance is 8,000. So it's not always as rosy as most people make it out to seem. So why? And hopefully this is what this webinar will help you address, to be able to determine the fact from the fiction, that expectation versus reality. Now, people ask that, is it a good idea to buy a property and rent it out? First of all, if you're going to rent out a property and you're buying it for an investment purpose, that's very different to buying a property that you want to live in. And then how do you decide? Well, honestly, what does your own gut say? Start with that. What does your gut say? Should you buy a property back home? Look at yourself living abroad. Do you think it's a good idea to buy a property back home, to buy property, or to do an investment somewhere else? How does the currency, if you're going to be sending your money back to South Africa and putting into rands and buying a house, how does the currency, the value of the rand affect that? What about tax? What about all the other costs involved? And very often people don't see those costs. They overlook those costs somehow. And then what is the actual performance of the different types of property investments or different types of investments out there around the world? So let's try and navigate our way through all of that. And then ultimately you decide what you think is best. So let's start with that gut feel, back home or keep your money abroad. Well, hedging your gut is one of those things where, if you're right, great, you made the right decision. If you're wrong, well, at least and you kept your money abroad, not all of it's there. So let's have a look at that. How do you know what to do with your gut? Well, the easiest way I found with clients is let's take a scale, balance a seesaw, whichever you'd like to call it, on a 1 to 100 or 1 to 10, and look at South Africa. We've got elections coming up soon. Look at the past 30 years now since we've been a democratic society, and then look at South Africa in terms of the future. Where do you see it heading over the next 30 to 40 years? Over your lifespan, for example. And let's say right now we're in the middle. Do you see things going downhill towards that 1, or staying where it is? It's not going to change. Or do you see things getting better? And the way I like to look at it, if it's going down, look at that Zimbabwe scenario. Imagine, do you see South Africa going along that route where the currency, the value of the rand, is still continually weakening, getting worth less and less? We're still politically unstable, having to deal with, and I probably shouldn't get into that, but politically unstable, never knowing who's going to team up with which team, and are they going to change the laws or not? Is there going to be land expropriation or isn't there? Are they going to adjust the currency exchange allowances? Do we have a lot of corruption still? Or, is it easy to get away with corruption? Is inflation still high? You know, rather than being that magical Goldilocks area of 1 to sort of 3%, are things still going up by 10, 15% back home? Do you see the country continuing with unemployment, particularly high unemployment, with crime and violence, unstable power supplies? Do you see us going along that route? Or, like some, do you genuinely believe that things will get better, substantially better towards the future? And in the next 30 years or 40 years, you see things going a Singapore route, where we have a strong, stable currency. It's worth more than all your other currencies, or many of your other currencies out there. It's politically stable. You don't have to worry about which politician or government is coming in or going out. Inflation is low. Things aren't becoming, exorbitantly expensive. The unemployment is low. Most people have jobs. There's no need for crime and corruption. The economy is stable and we're growing. It's safe and we've got a good power supply. Do you see things going that route? And very simply then ask yourself, if this wasn't your home country and it was a different country, would you invest in that Zimbabwe scenario, or would you invest in that, the Singapore scenario? Where would you send your money? And let's be honest, like I said earlier, if you're wrong, let's say you put your money abroad and you're wrong, South Africa does improve, well, you can always take your money back. But if you're right and you think South Africa is going to go that Zimbabwe route or downhill, and you've sent your money home, well, then it's too late to be able to bring it out again. So decide that for yourself. Where do you think is best, abroad or back home? That scenario between things getting worse to, or things getting better. Once you've decided that, then ask yourself genuinely, from the money side of it, just purely from the rand. Now, what is the rand or the ZAR? In its easiest way, and I've been told in previous webinars that I sometimes make things a little too difficult to understand, and I need to make life a little, not easier, but simpler. Now, if we look at the rand, imagine a company. In its simplest form, the value of the currency is the same as the share price of a company. If you were going to invest in that company, what is it worth? Why? Well, because the share price, when you buy shares in a company, if that share price is high or low, it gives you an indication of how desirable it is for that company, how many people want to buy into that company, the health of that company or the economy. Do they want those companies' products, its exports, and services? Is it being effectively managed? Is it the board of directors? Do they have control of everything? The government and its cabinets, do they manage the country well? The trust in the actual CEO or the president and his cabinet, as I said earlier. It reflects the expectation of what that company is going to do. Do people genuinely think it's worth paying money for those shares because it's going to be doing well and it's going to earn them a good income or return? Same as with the country. Do they think that country is going to be doing well and that value, that currency will become worth more, or do they think it will become worth less? Now, if we look at the rand, and we can go back 10, 20, 30, 40 years, as much as you like, we have something that we now refer to as the 10-year slide. Well, that's what I like to call it. And on average, it loses about 5% of its value. Now, very simply, if we look at that, whether we're looking at dollars or euros or pounds, we have the exact same thing. The fact that the rand loses value, it becomes worth less and less as time goes on. And something I've liked to ask clients, if you like property, I'm not saying, and please don't, get me wrong here, I'm not saying don't buy property. For those who like property, and I have clients within my portfolios who own property, then buy property. But ask yourself that one question. If you owned property now and you were receiving rent, when you're 16, you're retired and you're receiving rent out of your property, would you prefer to get that rent in rands? Or would you prefer to be getting that rent in pounds and euros or dollars? So now that we've looked at your gut, we've looked at the currency side of things. Do you want to be getting rands or do you want to be getting pounds? Let's look at it from the tax side of things, because that's another very important aspect that affects your investments and that affects the growth of your wealth, your money. South Africa, there is no denying it. We are known as a high tax jurisdiction. Income tax in South Africa is taxed at up to 45%. Dividends on companies' shares is taxed at 20% at a fixed rate. And any capital gain growth is taxed at up to 18%. Now, why are we called a high tax jurisdiction, a high tax country? Well, let's compare it to somewhere like the Isle of Man or Guernsey or the Bahamas. There are quite a few. There are many jurisdictions out there where there is no income tax or no dividends taxes or no capital gains taxes. Even parts in Asia, China, taxes are less than they are in South Africa. In Korea, taxes are roughly 3%, 3 to 5%, considerably less than what we have it here. So, the only way we in South Africa or a South African get a similar scenario where you're not having those taxes, where your money can actually grow free of tax, is either through a retirement fund or some form of pension fund, or as a tax-free savings account. The problem, though, that we have with that is that if you're going to go that retirement route, you're not going to be able to own a property within it, but you can own property funds. However, that still said, once you finally start taking that money out at 55, which is the earliest you can take it, it must be taxed as income. And if you look at that, those three things above, capital gains tax is the cheapest type of tax, then dividends tax, and the most expensive kind of tax is income tax. So yeah, you can grow it free of tax now, but it's going to be taxed as income, which is the most expensive type of tax we have. As for the tax-free savings account, well, the most you can save is 3,000 Rand a month, or be taxed at a fixed penalty rate of 40%. So, and no one is ever going to become rich or build a property portfolio or build enough money to even be able to retire on at age 90 with just 3,000 Rand a month. So let's not take my word for that. Let's look at some outside sources. And if you look at 10X, there's an example of their ad for their tax-free savings account. By saving the exact same amount, you could end up with 30% more money just by putting into a tax-free savings account. Let's try looking at Discovery. Discovery Bank will tell you tax-free savings is a great way to save for your long-term goals. Sanlam, even their projections show you that by saving the exact same amount, you will end up with considerably more money if you're not paying tax on your savings. Old Mutual, the exact same thing, saving the exact same amount either with or without tax, where you're not paying tax, that money grows better. But one thing that you need to be aware of is that 3,000 a month. And here very clearly from ABSA's own website, you'll see that if you invest anything more than that 36,000 a year or 3,000 Rand a month, you will be taxed at 40%. So you'll be penalized at a tax rate of 40%. 40% is a lot. It's a high tax rate. Don't trust what ABSA has to say? Well, look at Alan Gray. They tell you the exact same thing, that you will pay a tax penalty of 40% of any amount you invest above that maximum of 36,000 Rand a year. So what about if you're buying a property and you're not particularly investing into funds or anything else? Well, property also has taxes. There's the value that the property itself grows at, which is capital gain, and there you will pay tax on that at up to 18%. Imagine a world, though, where you could have that money grow and not pay any tax on it. Then also, let's have a look at the rent, because if you're buying it for an investment and you're not living in it, I'm assuming you can rent it out rather than give it to your brother or sister to live in and get nothing. And there too, any rent you receive will be taxed as income. So it'll be taxed at those income tax rate. And that can be as much as up to 45%. So if the aim is to genuinely build that property portfolio where you have 5, 6, 7, 8 different properties all giving you rental income, you will end up paying tax at up to 45% on all of that income. So if there's all these taxes involved, if there are all these costs and everything else involved, which we'll go through later, why do people buy property? Why do we have that need? Why is there that, I want to say burning sensation, not quite, but why is there this drive to buy property? Very simply, it comes down to culture and our upbringing. It's the sort of thing where your parents, your grandparents, every single person out there has always told you, buy property, you must own your own property. You have that feeling of security that I physically own something, it's my house. That's something real, you can go and look at it. A place that you can call home. But therein, remember that a place you can call home. Buying an investment property is very different to buying a home. It's what everyone says. It's better to rent than to buy. How many people have told you that? And often look at who are the people telling you that? Are they experts? Are they economists? Or do they own property themselves and rent them out and get that sort of income? It's a safe investment. That's what everyone else says as well. And also the other thing that I regularly is, well, you're paying off someone else's bond. Why pay off someone else's bond when you can have them pay off yours? So there's a lot of argument and reasoning behind why you should own property. But let's look at the actual detail. Now, if we look at, for example, in many European countries, many people rent, they don't own. South Africa, the UK, we are very different. We're very much similar to China and to Russia, where everyone likes to physically own their own piece of land or their own piece of property. And like I said earlier, it's having that place to call home. It's that emotional versus that investment argument. Are you buying a property because I like the bathroom tiles, or it's got a great kitchen or outside braai? Or are you buying it because you want to make money? Very often the place that you want to buy to make money is not going to be the place that you buy because you like the bathroom tiles. And one of the things that led me to this webinar as well is because I've been asked for so much about this sort of question. It was then last year when this news article came out, and I thought, maybe I should use this to actually do a webinar. And here ENCA interviews a property economist, Evan Roeder, about renting inside South Africa. And you are welcome to look this up and view the entire thing yourself.
Now the logic behind owning a house has always been that you're going to get capital growth. So if you're not going to get capital growth and you've got to gear your investment with a 90% mortgage bond, guess what? You are into negative territory. The financial people call it negative gearing, right? So you're actually sitting with a very poor investment purely from an investment point of view.
So let's break down what he has said. He is speaking from an investment perspective, not from that emotional, I want to own a home, a place that is mine. He is speaking from, if you're going to take money and make it grow, you're going to buy a property, rent it out. From an investment perspective, it is a bad decision. And he speaks about negative gearing, which is something that we will leave for a different conversation. It basically makes your losses bigger than if you hadn't taken out a bond, for example. So why? What is the premise for this? How do we make this simpler for everyone to understand? Well, Simon Brown wrote an article in the Financial Mail, and this is why this news article came out on ENCA. It was based on this one by Simon Brown. Why renting, not buying a home, is best. And in his article, you can read the article as well. You can find it on Financial Mail. Essentially, what it boils down to is the fact that buying a house is expensive. There are taxes involved and there are fees involved. Then not only that, when you finally sell that house, that is also expensive because there's the estate agent's fees, which can be up to 7%, and there's VAT, so tax added onto that as well. There's the maintenance of that home or apartment involved, which averages at around 2% a year. And now I'm not one of those people where I give advice on one hand and do the other thing myself. No, my own property that I'm in at the moment is not one that I own. It's one that I rent. And I can tell you from experience, everyone overlooks that maintenance cost. Now, the home that I live in, it's not a very large home. It's a smallish home, but it's a 4-bedroom. And 3 years ago, the landlord had to put in a second bathroom, which cost him around 70,000 Rand. This year, he's going to have to redo the swimming pool because the swimming pool is 30 years old and it either needs to be relined completely or it needs to be fiberglassed. And it's a large pool, and it's going to cost him anywhere between 60 to 100,000, depending on what he decides to do. Now, I can tell you that 60 to 100,000, along with the money that he spent on upgrading the one bathroom, because the other bathroom desperately needs to be redone as well, has taken up more than a year's worth of rent. So, very often people overlook that maintenance cost. It will get there. You might not be paying it now in year 1, year 2, within the first 5 years, but you're going to have a roof that leaks, a storm that comes in and damages something, and insurance pays for some, but not everything. You're going to have that geyser. You're going to have landlords who, if you're not lucky, or even the average landlord, you're going to have someone who's going to nail walls or holes into the walls, stick up press stick all over things and damage things, and you can have dogs and cats and all sorts of things. That said, though, I'll be honest, my cats have caused less damage than my kids ever, and I've got 6 cats. But this is the thing, you have that maintenance cost, and most people overlook that. So property is expensive. And add to that the fact that the average person moves every 7 years. So, you're going to be buying and then selling it to move to somewhere else. Now, compare that to a REIT, so a real estate investment trust company. So, if you were to take an average investment into property, a JSE, so listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, there your average cost is 1%. You don't have the buying and the selling fees, the maintenance fees, and the rates and taxes. The average cost is just 1%. Not only that, it's expertly managed by professionals within the industry, and you're invested into more than one property at the same time, not just a single one. So if you like property, perhaps, and you like South African property, perhaps have a look at that, just from the cost perspective. So let's go further on into that then. Now, one of the things that I set out to do when I did this webinar the first time was to actually use real world examples. And here is an example of a South African, a different one not that I mentioned earlier. She lives and works in China. She bought an investment property in South Africa for 2.9 million. She put down a 10% deposit, and she's paying 24,000 a month on her bond. She's renting that property out for 28,000 a month. In 5 years' time, she'll be earning 41,000 per month. In 10 years' time, she'll be getting 60,000 a month in terms of rent. So, I mean, could things sound any rosier? What a brilliant idea. 24,000 bond, 28,000 rent, 4,000 profit every month. Sign me up. So let's see how true is that. And this is obviously from my discussions with her. Now, the information, just to make life a bit easier, the fact that this is not just all thumb-sucked, the rental growth that I use in my calculations going forward is 5%, not 10%. The fact that the property will grow in value by an average 3.5% every year. And remember that one that I started off with? Her property grew by 3.8%. The bank interest rate of 11.75, which is what she was paying when we had the discussion. Now, this excludes any banking costs and excludes any taxes, income or capital gains tax. I'm just looking at the property and the basic financials. We're looking at the fact that the Rand, using that last 10 years, depreciates at an average of 5%. Now, we know from longer periods of time, if you take it over a longer period over the last 30 to 40 years, it's closer to 7 to 9%. And then we're going to assume that, well, if she were to take that money, set and invest it somewhere, she'd be getting 7% growth, which is very conservative. And I'll show you later why. And we're going to say that what is it that she invests? Well, the difference. So, the difference between what she gets in her rent and the difference in what she's actually paying in terms of all her costs. The deposit that she put on her, so if she, rather than putting a deposit on an apartment, put that deposit into an investment. And then instead of the little extra that she pays every month on fees, she put that into the investment as well, where would she be? Now, again, none of this information is thumb-sucked. We've used real-world information from the experts. We looked at Lightstone, their latest during last year, their latest residential statistics. And you'll see that where did property go up in terms of the value of property? Where did they go up? Well, this client was in KwaZulu-Natal and it went up by 3.39%. So we said it went up by 3.5%. So we're giving her the benefit of the doubt. You'll see that rent itself does not go up with inflation. The average rent last year in South Africa increased by 4.6%. Mine went up by 5%. Inflation was considerably higher. So that rent goes up 10% every year, it is just simply not true. We've looked at the different growth statistics within the different provinces inside South Africa. How much have they grown year on year? And then for the investment, we've looked at, right, I've said, imagine that investment grows at 7%. If you were to go and take a stock standard investment, just buying the S&P 500, so buying a tracking fund in the top 500 companies in the US, your growth would have been, and you can see that at the bottom, an annualized return of 10%. Now you could say, oh, I love these financial advisors and these wealth managers. They like to thumbsuck information. You chose the perfect dates for that. Okay, so let's go even further. Let's look at that S&P 500. What has their average returns been? And you can see for the past 5 years, it's been 11%. For the past 10, 12. For the past 29. Even if you go back to 100 or 150 years, the average is 9%. So saying you're only going to grow at 7% is, being very conservative. Hopefully I haven't lost anyone there. Don't trust me there? Well, let's have a look at PSG in terms of South Africa specific and see, look, Matthew, you're saying my property is only going to grow by X. I know it's going to grow at 10%. So let's look at the experts then. If you don't take Lightstone, and this is from PSG, their latest, their statistics from last year. And if we call that a smarty box, it shows you what are the different asset classes, the types of investments in South Africa and how much they've grown by each year. And if you go into that information, you'll see that South African property over the last 10 years has only grown on average by 2.1%. And in actual fact, up until last year, over the last 5 years, you'd actually been down 3% versus that 9% in terms of the S&P 500. So there too, I could ask you, do you want an investment, or if you're saving money, do you want something that grows at 9% or something that grows at 2%? So let's have a look at that then in actual detail. What does that mean? And here I've now projected those two things into a graph and said, right, your property versus your different types of investments out there. Now for the property, and the property you'll see is the nice red line. There I'm assuming that your tenant, you're renting out, you bought a house, you're renting it out, and your tenant always pays the rent every month without failure. He never misses or skips a payment, which we know is not true because statistically in South Africa, and this comes from SA statistics, 20% of your tenants in South Africa are in arrears with their rent in this particular area where this client has her homes. Nationally, it's around 18%. And let's also assume now you never have a month, ever in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, you never have a month where your property is empty, where you're waiting as one tenant's moving out and another tenant needs to move in, which we again know is not true and it's just not going to happen. The vacancy rate, specifically in this area, ranges between 4 and 12%. So she's going to have at least 1 month every year or every 2 years where she doesn't get rent. And then let's hope that geopolitically, a party doesn't come in and implement land expropriation, or the value of prices don't go down because of changes in government policy. Now, if she did that, you'll see from that red button in 40 years' time, so if you take a very long-term view, she would end up worth 25 million rand. That's not bad for someone who put down a deposit of 235,000 and is paying 3 and odd thousand into it. Now, from the investment, which is the green one, you can see it's very different. And here too, I've listed other ones. You'll see I've got some, and these are real world quotations from these companies' websites. I've looked at Old Mutual, Liberty, Sanlam, Allan Gray, and then, as I say, the green one is the international one. And there I've assumed, for example, that these returns, despite them going up and down, we've used the average returns that they use on their websites. So this is from a lot of their information. And there you'll see Allan Gray, Sanlam, Liberty, they use an average growth of 7% for a balanced fund. Old Mutual's using 8%, which is why they tend to get close towards the property sort of side of things. And then the international company, I've used 7% growth, but added to that the fact that you're going to have the rand devalue at 5%. And there, very simply, just by rather putting your money into something like that where it grows free of tax and where it's not losing value, you could end up with 53 million. That's considerably more. So why? Something is fishy. Something doesn't make sense there. You know, how are you going to get that much more? There's something that we're not including, or something that we're not seeing. So just some backup information there very quickly. Again, in this particular area, 20.4% of the homes are in arrears in this client's area, which is KwaZulu-Natal. Now, why? It's because of the costs. Something that we don't see is the actual costs. Now, if we look at that property rental in year one, when she bought her property, the rent that she got in was 336,000. That's the rent she got in and what the property actually grew by, the value of the property. But her expenses were 778,000. So she actually made a loss in that first year. 20 years down the line, if she keeps it for 20 years, what the value of that property grows by, so that capital gain, and all the rent she gets in, now assuming she's not paying any tax at all, which we know she will eventually have to do, but let's assume there's no taxes, she'll have earned 13 million, or that's how much it would have gone up to. But her costs would have been 9 million. So she'd only in 20 years' time have made just over 3.5 million. Let's even take it over a longer term and say she's doing this for when she retires, for when she's 60, 70. You know, what then? Well, even in 40 years' time, that value of that house, of those houses that she bought, and all the income that she's earned over all those years would be worth 49 million. But all the expenses she would have paid would have been 24 million. Hence why she would only have gotten that 25 million versus the 50 odd million from an international investment. So let's look at that in more detail. These are just the quotes, obviously, from the different investment companies that I got. So what are we not seeing? Why, you know, what is that magical thing that everyone's missing out on? It's that maintenance. It's the actual costs involved. The property is growing well, the rent is good, but the costs are considerably higher. There's the maintenance costs, there's the rates and taxes, there's the building insurance. And I'm not talking about home contents insurance, because your tenant will have their own contents insurance, but you still have to insure the actual physical building. There's the rental management. And I know a lot of South Africans in particular who like to try and skip out on that until they have their first tenant who doesn't pay. And then they very quickly move over to, rather than having a brother or an uncle or an aunt manage their property for them, to getting a company with legal backing. So let's have a look at those costs. So for this particular client, her costs in year one was 253,000. Why? She put down a deposit. She had her transfer and registration fees. She has her building insurance. She has her rental management fees, and she has her rates and taxes. I'm not talking about municipal fees. I'm not talking about your water and your electricity and your refuse and your sewage. I'm talking about the actual rates and taxes part of it, which the landlord pays, not the tenants. If we look at those fees and we project them, well, then over the next 20 years, she will end up paying 3.8 million in fees. And again, even if you take it over that longer term to 40 years, why is she not making 50 million? Why would she only be making 25 million? Well, because just from those fees alone, she's going to be paying 18.5 million. Now, imagine someone gives you something and tells you it's going to cost you 18 million over the next 40 years. It's quite a heavy pill to swallow versus saying, well, it'll only cost you maybe 2 or 3 million. Which would you go for? So let's take that a bit further. So there you go. That's why she's not making 4,000 profit. It seemed good at the beginning, 28,000 rent, 24,000 bond, but she's not making 4,000. In actual fact, when we take into consideration, or we just look at her insurance, her levies, her rates and taxes, and her management fees, she's paying in 3,387 every year or every month. So let's take that deposit that she would have had and take that 3,387 and put that into an investment instead, since that's what it's costing her now. That's where that 53 million comes from, by the way. So there we go. She had to pay 161,000 in fees and put down a 239,000 deposit. The 161 is the transfer fees and the banking fees. So why does an offshore investment or building your money up offshore, why does it compare so differently to property type investment? Well, very simply, if you look at your first year, in year one, let's say you took that same money, you put it into international investment, and one that's where the fees are 5.5% on a time-based period, not on a value, fund value. You got your normal contract fees, your policy fees, all of those, which everyone says are so expensive. And then we compare it to the property, the real world assumptions and figures that we got from a real life client now. In year one, the blue line is the investment, the orange line is the property. Her fees in year one would have been 4,000 Rand versus the 253,000. Over the next 20 years, an offshore investment or a property, not a property fund, but a type of investment outside of South Africa would eventually have cost her 700,000 Rand. Her house would have cost her 3.7 million. And over the next 40 years, that investment, yes, it's a lot of money, but over 40 years, it's a long time, would have cost her 4 million. Her house, though, would have cost her 18 million. So if I gave you an investment now and said, which would you want? The one that costs you 4 million or the one that costs you 18 million? Which would you go for? Very simply, and I tried to dumb it down to a slice of cake. If you've got cake A and cake B, cake A costs 10 bucks to bake. The costs are small. Cake B costs 90 bucks to bake. It's quite high. And you can sell both those cakes for 200. Where do you think you're going to make the most money? Which cake would you buy? So this is just another graph, but I think I will give this one a skip. This is because I realized that the feedback I got from the last webinar was that I make it too complicated and get too involved. This is essentially comparing the investment growth versus the actual investment costs. And you can see the light green line is how much your investment grows. And the dark green line at the bottom is how much the costs are and how much they grow. And you can see the costs versus the growth is very different, very low compared to the growth. Whereas if you look at the actual property, the property, which is the blue, the rental income, how much you're going to get in rent, and the dotted blue line, how much will the property grow in value? Compare that, though, to the actual costs. The costs are quite a bit more. So that was the first real world example. And what was the outcome? Very simply, despite the fact that it was a high value investment that this lady made, an international investment would have been 77% cheaper. And as a result, she would have ended up with 195% more money at the end of the day. Not only that, she wouldn't have to worry about political risk in terms of governments changing, land expropriation. She wouldn't have to worry about the rand losing value. And she'd be able to structure it that she doesn't have to pay tax on it later on, which she wouldn't be able to do with the property. So the winner, I don't know what you all think, but for me, it's plain to see that the investment fund would have won. Take a second example, in case you think the first example is handpicked. Same, a different South African, also living and working in China, buys a much cheaper property. So similar to the other one that I started off with. For only 600,000. This time there is no deposit and bond of 7,000 over 15 years, not 20, to try and pay it off sooner. That argument, pay it off sooner, it saves you money. She's renting out that property for 5,800. So she is getting in slightly less than what she's paying because she's doing it over a shorter period of time. So she needs to pay in 3,700 every month. And her initial costs obviously were a lot lower at only 41,000. So she's not making a profit, but she is paying off the house sooner. Let's see if that's any different. Again, using the exact same assumptions as earlier and the same backing information. Here, if we look at it from a growth point of view, her property, if we look at it in terms of the house, would have grown to roughly 3 million over the next 40 years versus an investment fund which would have grown to 16 million. So 16 million, I'm sure all of you, if I told you in 40 years' time, look, I've got 16 million for you, would you prefer the 3? Who's going to say they prefer the 3? Again, if we look now at the costs for this particular client, her costs considerably cheaper, hence why she's able to make comparatively more money out of it than the previous client. But her costs are still high. Over the next 20 years, it'll cost her $1 million in fees, in actual costs, those maintenance, those building insurance, the actual estate, the levies, what's the word I'm looking for? Rates and taxes. If we look over the next 25 years, 1.7 million. Over the next 40 years, 5.6 million. That's how much it'll cost her in terms of that property. Compare that to an investment fund, and now the costs are coming to be getting a little bit closer. It's not such a large difference. Why? Because the value of the property and the fees involved are much lower. The exchange, the bond registration and transfer fees are considerably lower. And there too, you'll see that in year one, an investment would have cost her 2.3 million in an offshore investment, but by offshore, I don't mean a South African offshore investment. I mean a truly offshore investment, something from a company outside of South Africa abroad. Whereas this property cost her 71,000. Over the next 20 years, you'll see she'll have paid 1.1 million in fees. Her investment would have cost her close to 600,000. Over the next 40 years, if she keeps an investment and that property that long, her property would have cost her 5.6 million. The investment would have cost her 4 million. So not as big a difference, but 1.6 million is still 1.6 million. We'll skip that one. Here, if we look at that, so here using a much smaller property with much cheaper costs, even there too, an international investment would have been 27% cheaper. And she would have ended up then, as a result, with 390% more money at the end of the day. Again, protected from political risk or geopolitical risk, protected from the rand losing value. And again, she's able to structure it so that she doesn't have to pay tax on that income later on. So there too, even with a smaller value property, the winner is an investment fund. So then comes the question that everyone else asks me, so should I save now and then buy it later, or should I just buy now rather than buy it later? Because obviously if I buy it later, the price of the property is going to go up. Here too, I went and I did the calculations, and I assume that if you buy that property now and it grows at 3.5%, well, then in 10, 15 years' time, that property would be worth 1 million. That's 600,000 property, using the example that we just used now. So had that girl with that cheaper property rather just, kept the money, or should she have bought it now? Well, her property would have grown to 1 million. If it grows at 6%, so let's say it doesn't grow by what everyone else's property is growing by, somehow there's something magical about this particular property, and it grows at 6%, so nearly double, she'd end up with 1.5 million. If, however, she saved that money and put it into something as simple as the S&P 500 and got that to grow at 7% again, not that 9%, which we know it does grow at, and the rand devalues at 5%, she would have ended up with $83,000. And $83,000 would have been then worth between 2.7 and 2.9 million. Now, if you remember, her house would have been worth 1 or 1.5. So at 2.7 to 2.9, if she saved first and bought the property later, she could bought close to 2 properties instead. So there we go. Now, finally, so we've gone through, what does your gut tell you? What are the things that affect? There's the tax, there's the rand, the actual value, because it's a house in South Africa based in rands. And then obviously there's the actual inflation, the side of it. Now, what about your rights? Well, South Africa ranks 55th globally, according to the International Property Rights Index, behind Korea, Chile, Saudi Arabia, China, and Kuwait. So, you'd be better off buying property in one of those countries if you're having better rights, and being able to protect your property is important. The bigger issue here is land expropriation. Now, currently, and a lot of people don't know that, even some of you experts in the industry, the current provision, so the current law, does exist within the Constitution. It has since 1996 with the Expropriation Act 63 of 1975 and the Expropriation Bill of 2020. Now, so the law does exist for it to be done. Why? does everyone want it to be? And what is the holdup? Well, at the moment, the bigger holdup is not about whether it should be done or not, whether land should be taken away from people who own land. The bigger argument at the moment is what land. Now, if we look at the EFF, the ANC, and the African Congress for Transformation, they all agree. There is no argument there. They all agree on land expropriation. The difference is the EFF wants the land to belong to the state, whereas the African Congress for Transformation believes the Constitution doesn't need to be changed to do that. Some of the others still want to change the Constitution. The bigger level here, though, is that the bigger problem is that that legal argument here revolves around the meaning of property within the law. Because at the moment, it just alludes to property. And that includes movable property without compensation. So that's the bigger side of it. Not will it happen or when will it happen? It's which property should be involved when it does happen. And just that you think I'm not making this up or thumb-sucking again, here's an article from 2023 with the Democratic Alliance expressing their alarm to the fact that the ANC wants to press ahead with that land expropriation without compensation bill. Again, another one, no surprise, they're bringing it up again. BizNews, if we look at this one is also from March 2023, but even more recent, since if you think it was from a year or 2 or 3 years ago, here's March 2024, the fact that land expropriation without compensation is a red herring, the fact that it is not something, again, there's no need to panic for it. It's inevitable. It is going to happen. It needs to happen in an orderly manner. Now, imagine that happens and it's your house that's involved. Again, even January this year, the fact that the government looks to try and get those laws finalized before the elections. Now, luckily, things don't happen very quickly. More so, the fact that the EFF, who stands a very good chance of gaining much more power and taking power away from the ANC this year, the fact that their elections manifest is the fact that they want their campaign and their manifest to be anchored on the principle of expropriation of land without compensation. And they want all land to belong to the government. So hopefully we've answered all of that. A final bit of forward, though, is let's look at, don't trust me, let's look at what the rest of the professionals are doing out there. You know, if you feel that you're a great investor because you bought a property and it's doing well, well, what are the professionals that actually buy properties and invest in properties? What are they doing? And if we look at Stanlib, their property growth, and I've made the screen so small now that I can barely see it, but their average growth on theirs for the last 3 years has been around just over 1%. So, you know, again, you say you can make it grow by 10%. Stanlib's only been able to get theirs to grow by just over 1%. What about 91, one of the world's, you know, one of South Africa's largest fund management companies? There too, if we look over the last 10 years, they've only managed to get theirs to grow by 1.2%. Don't believe Standard Bank or 91. How about Nedbank with their investment groups? Well, Nedbank has managed to get theirs to grow by average of also, I can barely see it, but I'm assuming if you look closely, if you can see it, it's between 1% and 3%. Liberty, there we go again. Liberty, they've managed to get theirs to grow over the last 10 years at a rate of 0.46%. 1.7% if it's within a retirement, in other words, where there's no taxes. It just goes to show that difference, and again, no tax versus tax. Still, with no tax, 1.7% over the last 10 years. Satrix, a cheaper option usually when it comes to fees. Their costs are very good or very low. This particular fund over the last 10 years has also only done 1%. Coronation, very similar statistics. Theirs growing at an average over the last 20 years of 11%. Sorry, I'm struggling to see this now. 11% over the last 20 years and over the last 10 years at very close to 0%. Discovery, if you don't trust me, have a look at Discovery's ones as well. And there you'll see as well, their fund, how much has it grown over the last 10 years? 1.5%. Sanlam, How much have they been able to get their property investments to grow by? Over the last 10 years, roughly 0.2%. So there we go. If the professionals out there, your people who have the skills, the abilities, the money, the resources to do the research on which properties to buy, when to sell, they know how to manage those properties and get the most out of it. If they're getting between 0.2 and 1.5% average growth over the last 10 years, what is it then that you know that they don't know if you think you're going to be getting 10? So what are the alternatives? Well, what do you do then? Well, and this is something I like to discuss with all clients, you avoid those 3 deadly shins. You start off by trying to make sure that your money can grow free of taxation in a low inflation jurisdiction, so your money doesn't have to work as hard to keep its spending power, and where you don't have that currency depreciation, where your money is not losing value. So make sure whatever you're doing, whether it's through me or through anyone else, just make sure that it's in a hard currency, that it's in dollars, pounds, euros. Again, if you're going to buy property, buy property, but make sure it's in dollars or pounds. Make sure that where your money is doesn't have to work hard, and then also where it's not losing value. Make sure you speak to someone where you can get a diverse and balanced mix of investments. So if you're into that cautious property sort of thing, then have a look at that. If you're into something that's medium or faster growing, make sure you've got the right sort of thing for you. Make sure that you speak to an expat, someone who specializes with expats, people who live from around the world. There we go. And make sure that whatever you do at least meets your goals and your targets. Right, very quick then before we finish up, a very quick case study to show you that even the best of people get it wrong. So this is a 10-year case study, and this is from an expat, someone who returned to South Africa from the UK. And in 2012, he sold his home in Wimbledon and bought a home in South Africa in Camps Bay. At that stage, the pound was 12 to the rand, and he sold his home for 1.2 million and bought a home in Camps Bay with that 14 million rand. 2022, so this is from 2 years ago when he resold that home, it was then 20 rand to the pound, and he managed to get 30 million rand for that home. So he managed to double his money at least, so that was good. However, that same home in Wimbledon in the UK at that same time in 2022 was worth 3 million pounds, which in rands was worth 60 million. So he lost out essentially on buying quite a few more mansions by taking that, by selling his UK one and buying the South African. Why? Again, it's in a hard currency. If we take a longer term view, and this is from one, not mine, but from one of our senior partners clients, he in 1982 had the choice of buying either a home in Notting Hill in the UK or buying a house in Camps Bay, in Bishop's Court, a mansion there. And in 1982, a lot of people don't know this, but the rand was 1 to 1. So 1 rand got you 1 pound, or 1 pound got you 1 rand. So 100,000 rand was 100,000 pounds. And he bought the Bishop's Court home. 2022, it was 20 rand to the pound. And that home in Cape Town in Bishop's Court was worth 23 million. So from 100,000 to 23 million, he'd done well. However, he still kicks himself. Why? Because that home in Notting Hill was worth 14 million pounds. And 14 million pounds, if you turn that into rands, is 280 million rand. So he could have bought 11 Camps Bay homes if he'd just waited and kept his money in that hard currency. Please, if you'd like to have a chat, you're welcome to reach out. I always appreciate it. What I'm going to do is, while I answer some questions, there is a poll that I will bring up. And the polls help me to determine, am I being too difficult? It also helps me determine what to speak on and what kind of information best suits the people that I'm addressing. So if you wouldn't mind taking part in that poll, I'd really appreciate that. And then if there are any questions, I will answer those or endeavor to do my best to answer those questions. You are welcome to reach out to me on WeChat, Matthew Taron, or Kakao Talk, Matthew Taron, or on WhatsApp, or you can email me directly, matthew.taron@holbornassets.com, or you're also welcome to reach out to me through Facebook Messenger, Matthew.Taron1975. Giving away my birth year there clearly. Right, so let's go on and see if anyone actually has any questions. There is, if you haven't seen it, there is a Q&A box there where you can go down and you can type in your questions and I will answer them now for you if you like. Otherwise, you're welcome to reach out afterwards and I will answer those questions then in person, if you prefer that way. See, we have one or two people busy doing the poll. Thank you. I do appreciate that. It just helps me to decide who, what does my demographic look like? What do the people look like that I'm speaking to? And how should I adjust the presentation or the webinars that I do in future? No questions? I assume either I've been very good, or everyone understands everything, or I've gone and made it way too complicated as usual. It's a very tricky thing. One needs to try and give the information without dumbing it down too much so that you end up losing the authenticity of it and the integrity of the information. But also you have to be able to cover all your bases when it comes to what are the things that actually affect an investment or affect one's property out there. I see there's still quite a few people busy completing the poll, the survey. So thank you very much for that. I do appreciate that. The Q&A box should be on your screen. It looks like two little chat boxes. You click on that and you are welcome to ask whatever questions it is that you feel you would like to know more about. I did want to initially put 3 full comparisons in, one client with a high property value, one with a low property value, paying it off sooner, and then I was going to do a third one with a much lower property value where the client is paying the home off over the normal period of time. But then I thought I might make it too complicated by adding too many things. Right, I'm going to assume then that there are no questions, which is the first ever for me on a webinar, which is, I'll be honest, quite good. It means hopefully I've managed to make it a little bit easier to understand this time. I haven't made it too complicated, which is always a good thing, I imagine. There is a repeat of this webinar. I will be doing a repeat on Saturday, Saturday morning for everyone in Asia. So if you do have anyone else that you think would benefit from watching it, or you'd like to watch it again, you're more than welcome to join us on Saturday morning. I think it is 9 a.m. in Chinese time and 10 a.m. in Korean time. Okay, all right. I'm going to then end the webinar. I don't see any questions coming through. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to either some of you reaching out or speaking with some of you later. Thank you. Bye. There we go. Stop.